Hello again, folks. Real Flight Simulations here again with what will probably be my last video with the A350 before moving on to other things. I'm going to do some pre-flight setup tips, and I'm going to initiate that setup with the inbound crew, let's say, bringing the aircraft in for you. The scenario starts with the engines running and then shutting down, doing a shutdown checklist, and then you're all ready to start. We're not going to do the cold and dark startup. You'll note that most everything on the overhead panel is turned on and ready to go other than exterior lights, just as you would find it when, say, the aircraft is doing a turnaround or maintenance has woken up the aircraft, so to speak, which is often so that they can get their checks performed. Passenger signs like seat belts and emergency exit lights will be defaulted to off as well, but it will save you from punching off all the other white lights on the overhead. The inertial nav units will already be aligned, and technically on a real flight they should be realigned, but the choice is yours. Since these inertial units are almost too perfect, you certainly don't have to. We will begin with the aircraft at the gate, and here for my example I'm using Minneapolis, which is KMSP, and we start by using the ground service options to put the external power on the aircraft. And for expediency, I am setting other options like chocks and support equipment checkboxes here. Now, certainly they would not come right up to the aircraft while the engines are still running. In any event, I'm using the checkboxes, and we'll just say that the support equipment is primed and ready to get going just as soon as able. I have the Thrustmaster TCA throttle system, and that is set with my engine switches set to shut down the engines, and I'll do that as long as I have some sort of electrical power available. I make sure that the external power is applied. Alternatively, you could have started the APU and you would wait for it to come up. The engine anti-ice will already be off, as will be the beacon and lights. Turn off the fuel boost pumps, and it's all done. This might be a good time to set the transponder to the master function, but that is not really a shutdown item. The real aircraft auto detects, or I should say auto selects it to standby after landing. And using the new checklist mod that's in here, we can see that everything is shut down. And I've got a link in the comments for that checklist mod if you need it. I have zoomed in on the shutdown checklist, and you can see that it goes green and it stays green when we refresh it, so we know that that is in fact complete. Now we can look forward to the pre-flight. So the beginning of a real pre-flight begins with cycling two Windows-based laptops through a restart and a full boot-up sequence, and they each reside in a box just outboard and behind each pilot's seat. Next, we cycle each of the three inertial units from nav to off and back to nav. And in real life, they should spend at least 5 seconds in the off position. So that is done here. The next page you need for pre-flight is the init page. Then in order to get any data, we're going to go to the OIS and look at 2 pages, passengers and fuel. And I'm not too worried about cabin, but at the end of this we'll come back to the perf calculator page for our takeoff numbers. Use the unload packs and the unload fuel buttons, and kind of realistic in a way, since the inbound flight is unloading the passengers and cargo. Not so much with the fuel, we wouldn't need to defuel the plane, but you get the idea, and it does give us something of a clean canvas to work with. I'll make up a flight number. I'll insert my city pair. I can put in an alternate if I have one. Unfortunately, there's nothing if you select the company flight plan request. The route select button lets us load up a X-plane formatted flight plan, and you may see some of your other flight plans in there. I like to get mine from simbrief.com, which I really recommend, and it is free. I recommend Navigraph, which owns SimBrief now, but that does cost a little bit. We'll fill in the flight level. The temperature auto-populates. A good cost index might be as low as 50, but I use whatever SimBrief says I have. The tropopause altitude is seen in the real airplane, but I don't know that the tropo value or the cost index on this screen make any difference in the Flight Factor A350's speed and fuel calculations. But it is here, and the trip wind is probably much the same. In fact, I don't know if that has any effect, but I think the headwind of 200 might just be a default value. For the IRSs, check that they're aligning by clicking the big box labeled Align IRS, then Return. Click the Departure box and input your takeoff runway, the Standard Instrument Departure or STAR, and the transition fix. Work from left to right, and then use the temporary flight plan button to look at it as a whole sequence of fixes on the flight plan page, and if it's good, you can go ahead and accept it. In my case here, I had a discontinuity, which signifies the vectors, which I'll undoubtedly have to get before being cleared direct to jet it or some point beyond. The Flight Factor A350 lets you do things with a A320, 330 style FMS if you want to use it. And I'm glad it has this, but you don't have to use it. The performance pages are all available in a somewhat abbreviated form. The pre-select space comes in handy if you need to limit the speed to some value for the departure. It automatically comes up in the pre-selected speed as soon as you lift off if you have a number in here, and it will not go to the climb profile speed until you're actually ready to set a manage speed in the speed window. Looking at the flight plan, we'll select our destination city and put in what we can at least tentatively expect as the arrival runway, the approach, and the STAR, the standard terminal arrival. In the simulation, you have to work left to right from runway to approach, the approach via point, and the STAR, which is named in the procedure, and then on the far right is the transition of the specific leg where you're picking up the STAR. Again, the simulation forces you to work left to right. In real aircraft, they don't have quite that limitation. In real airplanes, and even the Boeings, the Mad Dog, and everything else, when you select one parameter, it has a kind of a filtering effect on the other parameters that are available. So a certain STAR might only work with certain runways, and so if you were to select that STAR, some runways or approaches or transitions might just be filtered out for the drop-down box. But that's not the case on this, so just work left to right. Anyway, once we get our full flight plan, we could just use the up-down arrows to look for discontinuities or make sure we have altitude or speed constraints in the fixes. You can use either FMS to do that. Again, the way I have mine loaded, the discontinuities only exist where I would be getting vectors anyway, so that is all well and good. With our flight plan loaded, I can once again turn my attention to the Pax Fuel Load, and honestly, I go to light or middle with the load. I can experiment with the cargo containers, and it'll give me an amber number if it's not a legal or correct configuration. But a CG that comes out to be in the mid to low 20s is fine. You can accept the container loads as it gives it to you. I do run my SimBrief profile with a positive correction fuel kind of a fudge factor of about 5% for long flights, so that I'll have enough fuel at each fix and not have too much consumption. The alternative is you start noticing that you're running low on fuel at each fix, and then you have to keep adding fuel. So either way, we get it right here, and then when the load looks good, we'll press the implement button. As far as the fuel, there's two ways you can go about this. You can take the sim brief numbers and take the block fuel from the flight plan and just insert it in the destination field. Take the fuel to the alternate from the flight plan, insert that in the alternative field. The contingency fuel is shown in the sim brief plan, and you can insert that in the contingency box here too. Notice for my example, 10 minutes of taxi time gives me 500 kilograms of fuel that the sim brief flight plan calls for. The Flight Factor calls this box to remain, is their version of reserve fuel, and you'll see that that is available in a sim brief flight plan. It should all add up to what the sim brief flight plan calls for. Alternatively, I've done this and it's worked, but you can also make all fields 0 and just put the total fuel in the destination box. It's your choice. Again, notice route reserve and jettison gross weight, they can stay blank. Alternate is filled in if you have one, and you certainly would if you're flying internationally, but if you were flying a domestic flight plan with very good weather at both ends, you would probably just have contingency fuel only. We'll get takeoff performance from the left OIS screen. Flaps are pretty much always going to be 1, although sometimes they're 2 on the runways that are on the shorter side, but 1 is pretty much the standard. Takeoff power will probably be a flex number of some sort. Heavyweight takeoffs would use the full power. The real airplane has a percentage thrust D rate, and it's not modeled here, but flex is fine, and the default flaps, we'll just set those to 1. Transition altitude is important, and it seems to adjust based on where you're starting out, which in the United States that would be 18,000 feet. These performance or perf tabbed pages all correlate directly to the perf function in the other FMS in the center console, and you would select each phase of flight, whether it's takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, or approach, just using the right arrow on that FMS. So it's really just another presentation of the same information. It's not a bad idea to check the surveillance SURV button. It's surveillance there, and it defaults. Defaults work fine here as they would in the real aircraft. The only thing I'll caution here is that when you press default, it resets the squawk code to 2000 from whatever you have. Also, make sure that the transponder is set to master and not slave. Set it to the on position instead of auto when you taxi, particularly if you're using VATSIM, because they want to see your transponder code right away. Now on a real pre-flight, they would check the dispatch status and the recall all buttons, and they would compare that to the logbook. But I don't think you're going to catch any discrepancies on the Flight Factor A350. This is actually one of the first things they do when they start the pre-flight. So I'm just showing it to you here. Up on the flight guidance panel, it's similar to what you've seen on the 319, 320, 321 series of aircraft. Initial altitude goes in the altitude window. Flight directors would be on with a single button in this case. On each side, the EFIS display push buttons. Mostly just have the constraint buttons turned on, and VOR, weather, traffic could all be off, and in fact radar is required to be off at this point. And then come down, check the the altimeter settings, the buttons for L, S, and W will be then off. And as we start to wrap up here, we get the APU going. We can get all the fuel boost pumps on. That would be part of the pre-flight. Remember, the philosophy is white lights are out in the normal position. For some strange reason, Flight Factor has decided that the electric hydraulic pumps, the blue lighted switches on the overhead, that they would be on all the time under their guarded switches. This is an error, but we can live with that. And that is it, folks. Put the airplane power onto the APU, go through your pre-flight checklist and pushback checklist. You can start to figure out your pushback with, if you use the Better Pushback plug-in, that's fine. And then make sure all the equipment is away and the doors are closed, and you should be able to get underway. So that's about it for now. Stay tuned for the next video, and keep on flying and keep it real.